Cervantes' larger project of touring the social world of the 17th century Spain takes a curious turn in chapter 22 when he happens upon a chain gang. He and Sancho are just riding along and they see this group of men essentially shackled to one another, walking along, and he stops them and talks to the guards, and you get this a curious little episode where you get to know these people a little bit in a way that not too many other pieces of literature at the time were indulging in, getting to know prisoners who are arguably the lowest members of society. This is a curious turn. So, but throughout, he has this curious, I keep using that word because it is, this peculiar, let's say, self-referentiality, especially in this episode, where it is very conscious of the role of storytellers. And he's stopping each one of these guys, not unlike Dante stopping all of the sinners as he goes through and asks them, well, what's your story? And they tell him in a somewhat, brief, encapsulated form what brought them to this state, that they are being shipped off as essentially galley slaves for the king, which is part of the larger mechanism of expansionism throughout Spain, looking for the new world. The crown is always looking for a few good men to exploit, and it needs people who can sit there and just pull an oar to get the Spanish Armada around the world. It starts off, with an explicit and curious reference, curious again, to the fake author here, to Cid Hamid Benengali, is the very start of this paragraph. Cid Hamid Benengali, the Arabic and Manchegan author, in the course of this most grave, high-sounding, minute, delightful, and imaginative history, all those words, again, layering on top of one another, gives you a sense of the layers involved in all of the artificiality, informs us that, well, of course he does. If an editor today, let's say, got a hold of that of this manuscript and somebody wanted to publish this, they would take that and scratch that out and say, well, of course he does. That's what an author does. An author tells us stuff, so lose that. But it's curious that Cervantes begins with that, to just remind you, this is fake, this is phony, this is all just smoke and mirrors, this is literature. It's supposed to be seen as layers of artificiality. So then they meet and they come across these people, and Don Quixote is somewhat confused by the sight, and he is somewhat outraged for a very specific reason. He is outraged not that there are criminals around, but that these people, criminals, these people are chained together and are prisoners themselves, because they specifically because the fact of being prisoners restricts their free will. And that little phrase crops up a couple of times here. Your free will. It's just repeated. It's like, well, I never really thought free. Of course, they're prisoners. They're chained up. They're locked up. That's what prisoners have to deal with. That's what makes them prisoners. But no, he is outraged that no matter who they are, they have lost their power of free will. It's curious that this just keeps coming up. It's an oddity in there, and just bear that in mind. and you get, as he starts interacting with he starts talking to the guard and asking for permission, and you get a nice little portrait of the criminal justice system, as it were. And it was actually fairly extensive at the time. It was a very sophisticated bureaucracy that Spain had built by this point in history. But it goes through the guards, and they Quixana says, I'd really love to talk to these guys. May I go and speak to them? And they hem and haw a little bit, and then they finally come up with, well, we don't see anything in the rule book about it, which gives you a sense of the layers of bureaucracy that they're dealing with here. Again, layers of bureaucracy in a rule book, artificiality. But then he starts interviewing the characters, and they are characters. They're all sort of fun in their own way. You get somebody who just says, well, why are you here? I am here because I didn't have what is it? $5. A small amount of money. I forget what, are we in ducats or something here? I'm not sure, but it was just a small amount of money, and that he didn't have, and so he found himself in, I guess, debtor's prison. To which Quixote very nobly says, well, I would give you that money right now. And he said, if I had that money just months, years, weeks, however long ago, then it would have made a difference, but now it won't. And it's just a poignant little moment there. And it's also curious that the reason Quixote is so interested in this is because he feels he has an obligation to, the duties, it is now time for me to fulfill the duties of my calling, which is to right wrongs and come to the aid of the wretched. Which is oddly noble, which is inspiring. Come to the aid of the wretched? You don't really find that in the courtly literature that he's always citing so well. Those are largely aristocratic adventures. And coming to the aid of the wretched is... it's a nice twist, and it shines a little light on that, because again, if you take a realistic view of it, you have Quixana, who can be seen as this somewhat valiant / pathetic character who is on the precipice of old age and is trying to live his life to the fullest and have some sort of a vibrant experience before, sliding into senescence. And to do it with such a noble undertaking, and to not do it just as a selfish thing, but to say, I'm going to do something noble and I'm going to help people with it. That's quite inspiring. But anyway, he's meeting these different people. He meets one character who will come back later, who says, why are you here? I am here, he said, for the reason that I carried a joke too far with a couple of my cousins, German, first cousins, of mine, and a couple of others who were not mine. He has been having sexual relations with 2 first cousins and 2 other women who are not cousins to him, but cousins to one another. So it's a very complicated relationship, a somewhat bizarre Byzantine little familial pattern. And he starts talking about, well, it's confusing because there are the consequences, kids and personal effects and legality, all that stuff get really obtuse after a little while. But he has a certain decency about him, in that he just accepts, okay, well, I did all this, but I accept the sentences as the punishment that was due me. There's something intriguing about that. He will come back later in the book. And you get a couple of these characters. They're all sort of funny, all sort of peculiar. By far, however, the most notable is this man he sees, who stands out a little bit. He is dressed as a student, and one of the guards told Don Quixote that he was a great talker and a fine Latinist. And he notices this man more specifically, not just because of how he was dressed, but what he was wearing besides that, and that is extra shackles. He's wearing extra chains so that he can't really lift his hands to his mouth or get or down to his legs or anything like that, and his neck is chained, and he's just an extra layer of chains restricting his movements. No free will. And he's curious. So Quixote said, well, and you, sir, what's your deal? He says, my name is Inés de Pasomente, and he turns out to be a writer. He has written a book. He's a very curious figure. Just on the outside, we get all the details physically of who he is before we actually get the name. They go through making judgments about his appearance through his clothing, through the apparent his reputation as a great talker, and well versed in Latin, very smart and educated and literary. All these should be ringing bells about the authorship of this, and but also a little detail that he is cross-eyed, that he's got kind of a little squint to his eye, and this should be considered like, well, it's a minor detail. It makes someone look a little shifty, perhaps, but more specifically, it suggests that they have a conflicting perspective. They have an imperfect perspective. It is somehow, maybe they see double, maybe they see things just distorted, but there's something going on there about perspective that is off. And this little detail is dropped in there, and I would say very deliberately. So you get Inés de Pasamonte. The author or the guards originally describe him as otherwise known as Ignacio de Parapilla. So there's already a little question of what's his real name? Is this an alias? Is this just a nickname? What's going on? Ignacio is obviously a diminutive of Inez. So there's a lot of confusion about his identity and about his name explicitly. And they say, well, my just name is Inez and not Ignacio, and Pasamonte, not Parapillo. And he takes some affront. He seems to be very proud of his name and want to be forthright about it, let's say. And it comes out that he is an author. He has written a book, and he explicitly references it to Lazarillo de Tormes. Now, that is the iconic first example of the picaresque novel from a few years before Quixote. So it was very popular, and Cervantes had to be aware of it, and he's sort of writing in that semi-tradition, so he's going to, slide in a little thing there. So it's a literary reference within, made by somebody posing as an author within a chapter that is all about storytellers. That was begun by, the chapter was begun with an explicit reference to a fake author himself. So we're getting all of this piled on top of one another, and it can be a little bit confusing as you go along. And there's more talk about that. Quixote is curious. You wrote a book. What's going on? And he says, "Is it good? Is it a good book?" And he says, "It is so good," replied Inez, "that it will cast into the shade Lazarillo de Tormes and all others of that sort that have been or will be written." A little competitiveness there. So you can see Cervantes throwing an elbow at Lazarillo de Tormes and saying, yeah, it's all right, but somebody else is going to write something better. Gee, maybe it's going to be this book I am writing right now, huh, Cervantes? So he enters into competition of sorts with the Lazarillo. And the joke you can see within that, Inez takes great umbrage at being called Inacio, which is the diminutive, and throughout Lazarillo de Tormes, it is a play on the man Lazarus, or Lazaro, remembering his youth when he would have been Lazarillo. And there's a little bit of a play throughout that novel on that. So you're never quite sure of how old or whose voice is speaking in. Is it the adult who's remembering the thoughts and the words of the child, or is it the child is he reporting these accurately? There's all of that level going on. So again, this is just another ball in the air that Cervantes is juggling. And what is the title of this book? Said Don Quixote. The Life of Inez de Pasamonte. La Vida de Inez Pasamonte. Okay, good title. Quixote asks, is it finished? Inez responds, how could it be finished when my life is not finished yet? Which is kind of a trope on the life of. Early novels, and this is really where they get formed in the modern sense. Early novels were supposed to take you from life until death, generally, with a few exceptions along the way, and there's, whatever. But it's supposed to be a panoramic view of that. So again, the in-jokes just keep piling up. And so Inez keeps saying that, well, I actually kind of like going to prison because it gives me time to write, so I can get it all up to date, because every time he has a new adventure, like when he breaks out of prison, like he does from time to time, he has to write something new. It's like, So again, all of this is getting layered on and on and on. And throughout all of this, it is obvious that Pasamonte is a stand-in for what an author is in this time and place. And what's notable is that Cervantes is writing him as a criminal. In the late Renaissance, the pride of authorship, let's say, the dignity of the office of being an author, was on a stark decline. 100+ years after, or more than that, since the printing press with Gutenberg vastly expands the reading public. Now it is everybody can get a book of something, and they start becoming popular, and so the value of them starts to go down. Now you can talk about a lot of people are just scratching out books, of dubious literary value to begin with, to just to sell something so that people would have something to read at night. But just the nature of them. In the Middle Ages, before the printing press, monks had to sit there and transcribe books throughout Europe, hand by hand, letter by letter, and it's very laborious, and so books became very precious. But when it is universal access, it's a free-for-all, and the actual value of them drops. But ironically, As the scholars will tell you that as the value of the books tends to drop, and there's just more of them around, so how could it not drop? There is a certain preciousness about the author. The author becomes a kind of brand that people can latch onto, because when everybody can write and publish a book, chances are most of them are garbage, so you tend to look for just those that you know are coming from somebody good. You get attracted to brand names. And a name like Lazarillo de Tormes, which gets flagged around here, is a good blurb for Pasamonte to adopt and say, mine is going to be better than that. But here he is, at what is a low point in his life, probably, and certainly at the lowest point on the social scale that you can imagine, being a prisoner. But he is an author. If his book is, in fact, better than Lazarillo de Tormes, which at this point we have no evidence of this, if it is, then is he more important than the author of Lazarillo de Tormes? Socially, is he more significant? In history, is he more significant? This is even more complicated by the fact that Lazarillo de Tormes has no author. It is unknown. We just don't know. It's anonymous. So all of these complications about the status of the author to society, status of the author to the book, status of the author to the reader, the individual. All of these little questions are being shifted around, and Cervantes is having great fun poking it around and joking with it. And he's getting to know them, to know these people, and Cervantes gets outraged again about these people being restricted, no more so than Pasamonte, who again is extra limited in his movements, extra limitations on authors. Authors have less free will, perhaps, than anyone else. But he is sneaky. The reason he is in all those extra layers is because the guards fear they can't control him. He can get out. He is sneaky. He is crafty. Again, a little bit of a swipe or badge of honor among authors, being able to just come up with stuff and be, creative about things and to get around problems. Pasamonte is all of this. Well, a riot breaks out when Cervantes, or when Quixote rather, gets himself up in full dudgeon about, how these people have no free will. He starts fighting with the guards, and pretty soon the guards are on the ground, the prisoners break free, and Quixote says, "Oh good, you're all free. Now, all you have to do, I freed you, all you have to do is go see Dulcinea. Go to the village of Toboso, present yourself to Dulcinea, and explain to her that you are there as tributes to her beauty, sent by me, Don Quixote, the Knight of the Mournful Countenance." I love that name. Or Sad Face, depending on your translation. I like Mournful Countenance. But, La Triste Figura. Okay. Whatever you like. But they immediately say, well, that's a good idea, sir. Thank you for freeing us, and, we'll take that under advisement. But if we all travel in a large group together along the highway to Toboso, we will be picked up and rearrested and charged with extra time because we have escaped. So we're not going to do that. And in fact, they fight back, and they beat the bejesus out of Quixote again. And the guy who's been sleeping with his cousins and all that, in fact, takes the barber basin that Quixote's been wearing as a helmet. In fact, like whacks him on the head with it, and it's really very funny. But throughout, they run off and run into the woods and abandon him, and he and Sancho are just sort of left there with Rocinante and feeling rather dejected and banged up once again. So it's another little episode where they're quite humiliated and roughed up physically at the end. But it's that presence of authorship. It is that question of honor among authors. Inés de Pasamonte is the one who says, well, going to Toboso, that wouldn't work out for me, so I'm out of here. It's just a reminder as you turn the pages in this very long and very rich book with a lot of little episodes that don't necessarily add up into a coherent plot at times. It is necessarily episodic because you're meant to take these things in little chunks. It's just one more note being struck to remind you that an author should not be trusted. An author has many little sneaky wiles that can bend logic, conjure new realities, bring fantasy into your life in a way that you should not trust. Inés de Pasamonte does all of this, and Cervantes is using him once again to remind people that as they're sitting there turning the pages and enjoying the adventure, that they should keep one foot in the real world, that you can't trust the author. There's almost always some machinations, some ulterior motives, some duplicity involved. So enjoy it, go along with it, have fun with it, but don't get taken away.